Well, a lot of stuff going on in this story here. What we have seen so far in the book of Acts is a progression of the gospel going to different groups of people. It started out with the apostles, and they only shared the gospel to what I would call full-blooded Jews. These were Jews who were Jews not only by religion but also by birth. These were the descendants of Abraham there in Israel. And so these are the people that the gospel was given to at Pentecost, and these were the first Christians. And at the beginning, the apostles only shared the gospel with those who were full-blooded and full religious Jews. Then it went out, as Philip preached the gospel in Samaria, it went out then to the Samaritans. And the Samaritans were mixed race, Jewish and Gentile people. They were descendants of the Jews who were left behind after the Assyrians carried off the 10 northern tribes of Israel. And then there were a few Jews who were left there, and then the Assyrians brought in some Gentiles, and as they all started to live together there, they're intermarried. And then those people who were there, they were a mixed race, but they still worshiped Jehovah. They had their own temple up there, and they had the law, and they followed it. But they weren't considered full-blooded Jews anymore. And they were the Samaritans. And so then the gospel was taken to them. And so Peter went up there, as we remember the story, and he saw that the Holy Spirit had come upon them, and he says, okay, well, God, let's share it with the Samaritans. Then after that, Philip then shared the gospel with the Ethiopian eunuch, and this guy was what was called a proselyte. A proselyte was a Gentile who was fully converted to Judaism, taking on the full covenant of Abraham, including circumcision. So you could become a full Jew, if you wanted to consider it that, if you did the things that were necessary. You said that you believed it, you followed the law, and then you followed up with circumcision. And so you see this progression of it going first to the full Jews, and then to the Samaritans, and then to proselytes. And so that's where we are. Now here with Cornelius, this is where him and his family, his household come in. He was a centurion in the Roman army, stationed in the city of Caesarea. Cornelius was a Gentile who was a believer in Jehovah. And he was probably what was called a God-fearer. And that meant that he believed in God and he followed Jehovah, but he was not a full convert. He may have had access to the scriptures and followed them, and he would read them and study them. He may have even had access to the local synagogue, and the Jews may have allowed him to go in there and stuff. And he did his best to worship God and to live a holy life, and followed the law of God as best as he could. But he did not take on the covenant of Abraham, and he was not circumcised. Now, whether or not he was going to work up to that, we don't know. But that's how he lived, and there are a lot of people who live that way as well. I would kind of compare him to other men in the scriptures like Melchizedek, who was a priest of God, but he was not, him and Abraham were contemporaries. And he did not follow that covenant, of course, but he was not in that line of Abraham and all those. But Melchizedek was a believer in God, and he worshiped God, and he served him. And then also Jethro, who was the father-in-law of Moses. Jethro was from Midian, and he was not at all in the line of the family of Abraham in that way. And he didn't take on the Abraham covenant, but he was a believer. He worshiped God, and he was there, and he gave praise to God, especially when Moses met him out in the wilderness with the Israelites. He said, God has done through you what he said he was going to do, and he gave God praise. So there were people who followed God, who worshiped Jehovah, who were faithful to him, but were not part of the Abraham covenant. And so this was true of Cornelius and his entire household, and as we see also some of the soldiers in his regiment. So here was this group of believers who were Gentile believers and not Jewish. So up until this time, though, devout Jews did not have much to do with Gentiles. There was this division, and the Jews saw the Gentiles as unclean, especially those who lived around Jerusalem and who lived in Israel. Now, you get outside of Israel, and the influence of the Greek and Hellenistic culture was more common upon the Jewish people. They would have more to do with the Gentiles. But somebody like Peter, who lived in Galilee, wouldn't have very much to do with him. He wouldn't eat with him. He wouldn't associate with him very much. And so since the Gentiles didn't accept the Abrahamic covenant, they were considered by these devout Jews as being unclean. So it would be considered wrong to have much to do with them. And so in order for a Gentile then to become a believer in Jesus, they thought they had to first convert to Judaism and take on the Abraham covenant, and then they could accept Christ. And that's what Peter and James and John and all the apostles were working under up until this point. Because with Cornelius, God was going to change that. God was going to offer salvation directly to the Gentiles without conversion to the Abrahamic covenant. And God was offering the gospel and salvation directly to the Gentiles, beginning with Cornelius and his household. And the thing is, this wasn't something new. This wasn't something that God just threw out there last minute after he saw all these Jews being converted and the gospel going out to the to the synagogues and then spreading to the Samaritans and then the proselytes. It wasn't that God said, well, hey, let's just include the Gentiles too. He had a plan for this. He planned to include the Gentiles all the way back to the very beginning when he was talking about salvation. And when I look at this story, it's amazing how God has brought all these things together to make this happen. And you see a lot of different parts and pieces working together to bring this all to happen. And this is what we see here in the first half of this story of Cornelius. There's a lot of things going on. But God put a lot of heavy planning into this to bring all these together at the same time and at the same place. And God even points that fact out. He kind of makes this little notion there to say, look at what I've done to bring all this together. That's what we're going to look at today. Because like I said, there's a lot going on here. But what stands out to me is just the fact of how God works out his plan to bring about his purpose. His purpose was to bring the Gentiles in, and you see all these different factors coming in to make that happen. You know, that's something we've got to realize in our life more and more. We've talked about this quite a bit, but I see it more and more in the Scriptures. How God is so big, and he's so involved in everything. You know, we get so easily tied up in our own kind of tunnel vision of life. But God has all of us connected. And all working together, all things bringing together to accomplish his purposes. And so there are several things in this story that we can learn about God fulfilling his purposes. Now, I see a lot of things, but don't get afraid. I see 9 different things he's doing to fulfill this one purpose. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. We're going to get through these pretty quick. But in order to fulfill this purpose of getting the gospel to the Gentiles, we see all these things taking place. There's a lot going on here. And the first thing that we see is that God is going to fulfill his plan. When we look at the first couple of verses here, we see that there's a certain man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a centurion of what is called the Italian regiment, a devout man, and one who feared God with his household. And God had a plan for the salvation of the Gentiles. And he had this plan and was announcing it centuries before Jesus even came to earth. In Isaiah 49:6, God says, I will also give you, he's talking about Jesus, as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. Jesus was this servant who was the light to the Gentiles to bring them to salvation. So at least all the way back in Isaiah, he was talking about bringing salvation to the Gentiles. Directly saying that. Isaiah 60 verse 3 says, the Gentiles shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. And so the Gentiles will come to the light of God. And so he's revealing this plan, and this is several hundred years before Jesus came, that he wanted salvation to come to the Gentiles and the gospel to go to them. And so this shows us, very simply, that if God has a plan, he's going to fulfill it. And so that's what we see when we look back here. First thing, God will fulfill his plan. Don't worry about it. If he's got something in mind, he's going to get it done. And notice how he picks the perfect guy to do this. God didn't go to some pagan believer or unbeliever who knew nothing about this God of the Israelites. He went to a man who was a Gentile, but was a believer in God. Okay, so he was kind of both. And so he goes to this guy, and so then, So he could kind of be that bridge between the two. It bridges that gap between the Jews who followed Jehovah and the pagan Gentiles who knew nothing about him. And so God picked this perfect guy, and Cornelius was part of that plan. The second thing we can see about this is that God uses the faithful people to accomplish his purposes. And we read that in verses 3 and 4 about how God comes to Cornelius and he says to him, your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God. Cornelius was a faithful man. He did a lot of things to serve God and to serve his fellow believers. And God remembered those things. He remembered who Cornelius was. He remembered his faithfulness. And Cornelius proved through his faithfulness that he was someone that God could trust with such a great event to take place. And when God wanted to take the gospel to the Gentiles, Cornelius was that perfect person. And so God used this faithful man to accomplish his purpose. And that's something we need to remember, that if we desire to be used by God, let's show God that he can use us by first being faithful to him. And like he says in other places, what Jesus actually said in one of his parables, is that we prove ourselves faithful in small things, then he'll give us responsibility in bigger things. The third thing that we see is that God will send us to other people to help accomplish what he's going to do. I think this is very interesting. Verses 5 and 6. God tells Cornelius, now send men to Joppa and send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. He is lodging with Simon a tanner, whose house is by the sea. And Peter will tell you what you must do. Now we look at this and we think, well, why didn't God just tell him directly? You know, why did he send Peter and then have Peter come and share with him the gospel? Well, the reason that God does this is so that the Jews and the Gentiles will truly intermingle in the church. I mean, think about it this way. If God would have preached the gospel directly to Cornelius in his vision, Cornelius would have probably accepted Christ, and so his whole household. But then if Peter and the other apostles would have found out that, hey, there's this group of Gentiles in Caesarea who say they've accepted the gospel, they would have said, well, they're not Jews. They can't accept the gospel. So they wouldn't have accepted them into the church. And then you would have had a group of Jews over here and a group of Gentile believers, and they would have never intermingled. And if that would have happened, then Cornelius and his family would have become believers, and they would have started sharing the gospel. But then they would have said, well, why do we need to fellowship with those guys? They don't even like us. So God used this. He sent Peter to help intermingle those two groups together. And you know, that's part of God's purpose with sharing the gospel and ministering to other people, is he doesn't need us to do that, but he wants to use us to do that, to share his word out. As a matter of fact, there's more and more reports, and I've got an entire book that talks about this. There are places in the world where there are not very many Christians. And if you are a Christian, you keep it hidden because you're afraid of getting caught and maybe being killed or in prison or something like that. And so there are a lot of people giving reports out that they have dreams. And in this dream, a man will be standing in front of them, and he will tell them something like, well, you need to go to this town, and in this town go to this street, and on this street you'll see this building, and in this building there'll be a man or a woman there with a book, and do what they tell you to do out of that book. The same thing that happened to Cornelius. You go to this town, on this street, you look for this guy, and he's going to tell you what to do. Same thing's happening today. And those people go there, and that's a Christian preacher or a missionary or something like that, and then they'll follow Christ. But part of the reason God does that is so that then now they know they're other believers. They're not alone. And so they're automatically plugged into the family of God. And so God uses, he'll send us to others. The fourth thing then that we see is that when he sends us then to others, is that when we need to then involve other believers in God's plan. In verses 7 and 8 it says that Cornelius sends a group of men to go get Peter. Now, he was an officer, probably a very busy man. He had servants and stuff. But it's something this big and important, you might think, well, he'd go himself. and get Peter and bring him back. But he doesn't. He sends these men to Caesarea. Now this is a drawing of what they believe Caesarea looked like at that time. Very nice city, very, very well laid out. It was a Roman city built by Herod, who built this city, designed it. It was the main port city in Israel for the Romans to come and do the things they needed to do. And I believe in the things I looked at that this was actually the seat of Roman authority in Judea and in the area of Israel. And so this is where the Roman authorities stayed and where they stationed themselves. And they had a very nice port, and they had, you see up here the port that they built. They have a hippodrome and a palace down here, and then a theater, and it's a walled city and stuff. Very nice city. And these drawings are very accurate because a lot of those ruins and the foundations of them are still there. As a matter of fact, here's a picture of some of those. And this is from the opposite angle. That picture we just saw was from the south looking north. This is from the north looking south. And here's that port, what remains of it, that was in place. Here's the hippodrome back here, horse track basically. And then there's still several buildings and different things up and along here. And some of the things I was studying about this, one of the neat things was that they used, or they developed concrete that would cure underwater at this time. And I can't remember which Herod it was that did this, but he was an incredible architect. And he used that to help build this city and to build this port. But then after him, they lost that technology. They lost, how to make that concrete. And it had been lost for centuries until they figured out how to do it again. But that technology and that ability to do that, it was developed by Herod and by these guys that built this city. And so just a tremendous accomplishment to build this. But anyway, this is where Cornelius was. He was stationed here in Caesarea. And so Cornelius sent men to Joppa. And so here's Caesarea up here. He sends men down to Joppa to get Peter, and then Peter goes back up to Caesarea, and that's the area that we see is taking place. Why did he do this? Because he wanted to send men, and what we notice here is that Cornelius did not send non-believers to go get Peter. He picked out 2 men who were faithful servants in his household, and it said that his entire household were believers in God. And then it says he found a devout soldier, a man who also was a God-fearer. And he sent these 3 believers to go get Peter. And he used them because he knew he needed people that he could trust, that when they heard what was going on and the vision that God gave, they would catch that same excitement. They would know this was something important that God wanted to do. If he gave it to somebody who was a non-believer, he may look at it and go, well, I don't know what this crazy guy is sending us on, some vision he had of this Jewish God. Why are we going down there? And then they may go find some guy named Peter Jones and bring him back up, instead of Simon Peter. So he sent guys who were believers, and he involved other believers in God's plan because he knew he could trust them and that they would catch that vision and they would get excited about it. And I think he tells us to kind of do the same thing, get believers involved in God's plan. The 5th thing then that we see is that because God's going to do these things, he uses the faithful, he will send us to others, he wants us to involve other believers, and so when he's doing these things, he prepares us to get these things done. In verse 9 it says, the next day as they went on their journey and drew near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray at about the 6th hour. Then he became very hungry and wanted to eat. But while they made ready, he fell into a trance. Now, it's probably not a coincidence that Peter became very hungry before a vision that he had about food. The 6th hour was noontime. They started at 6 o'clock in the morning, which was the first hour. So 6 hours later was about noon. And so that was the 6th hour of the day. And in those days, Jews usually ate a lighter meal at noon. And so Peter wouldn't normally have been very hungry, as it says, at noon. He wouldn't have expected a big meal. Now, some of this will look at this and say, well, the reason that Peter had a vision about food was because he was hungry. and maybe he had a medical problem, maybe his blood sugar dropped or something, and he passed out, and so then he had this vision. Okay? But what's going on is not that he had a vision about food because he was hungry, but he was hungry because God was going to give him a vision about food. And God made him hungry so that his mind was on this. And he's already thinking about the proper foods to eat, and that he was hungry, and God was getting his mind prepared for this vision. You know, God will sometimes do things around us to prepare us for the next thing that's coming. How many times in your life have you wondered why certain things were going on and certain things were taking place, and then all of a sudden something changes, something comes up, and you're going, maybe God did that just to get us ready for what's coming. So God will get us prepared for the things that he's going to do. The sixth thing then that we see about God fulfilling his purposes is that God's plans change things. That's why he prepares us, because when he does something, it changes things. We don't like change. So God gets us ready, and because change is coming. Verse 11. Verse 10 actually says, he fell into a trance, and he saw heaven open, and an object like a great sheet bound at the four corners, descending to him and let down to the earth. In it were all kinds of four-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. And a voice came to him and said, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean. And a voice spoke to him again the second time, What God has cleansed, you must not call common. This was done 3 times, and the object was taken back to heaven. The New King James Version here says in verse 15, as I just read, What God has cleansed, you must not call common. I like the New American Standard way of translating it. It says, What God has cleansed, no longer consider unholy or unseparate. Jesus' resurrection, what Peter was working under and all the other Jews, were the Levitical laws concerning food and what they were allowed to eat, what was considered clean and unclean food. We see Jews and Jewish people who are still following those laws. Those are those kosher laws that they follow about what they can eat, what they can't eat. But Jesus' resurrection fulfilled the sacrificial requirements of cleansing away sins. And so the Old Testament animal sacrifices, they only temporarily covered our sins, but Jesus' blood cleansed them away and made atonement. And so when that happened, the ceremonial laws regarding clean and unclean foods were no longer needed. Peter didn't understand this yet. But he no longer had to worry about the ceremonial laws. And he no longer had to worry about the ceremonial laws about being around Gentiles and being around people like that who would make them, quote unquote, unclean. And so God was preparing Peter for a big change. That's why he gave him this vision. He's showing him, Peter, something's coming, and I'm explaining to you what I'm doing. You know, and that's what happens a lot of times when God does something. He changes things. We don't always like change. But God's plans bring change, so we need to be ready for them, and we need to accept them. And that actually takes us back to number 1, because God's going to fulfill his plans. And those plans are going to bring change. So we need to be ready for them. The 7th thing then that we see is, because God's plans change things, is that God's plans a lot of times reach beyond what we can see and what we can understand. In verses 17 through 20, Peter is sitting there wondering about the vision. And it says here that, now while Peter wondered within himself what this vision which he had seen meant, behold, the men who had been sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house and stood before the gate. So at the very time that Peter was sitting there contemplating this vision, these guys are standing outside. These guys are coming to meet him. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. God's showing us, look at all the things I'm working together. While Cornelius was given a vision and said, go get Peter, then the next day those guys start going to get Peter. While they're on the road, Peter has a vision, and as soon as his vision's over, Peter's sitting there on that rooftop going, what in the world is God trying to tell me? And then all of a sudden some servant comes up and says, hey Peter, there's some guys out there. But that was actually just after God spoke to Peter again and said, Peter, there's some guys coming to meet you. You need to go with them and do what they say. And then at that time, this guy comes running upstairs and says, Peter, there's some guys out here. Peter goes, I know. God just told me. So God's saying, look at how I'm putting all these things together to accomplish my plan. He had this timed out so specifically and so perfectly, down to the very minute of what was taking place. You know, Peter didn't even know that anyone was at the door, was at the gate. But God told him these people were there. And beyond that, their arrival then explained to Peter what was going on. He's not talking about food, he's talking about Gentiles, and that I can go with them. It was about God removing the barrier between the Jew and the Gentile. Romans 10, 11 through 13, Paul describes how God did that. For the Scripture says, whoever believes on him will not be put to shame, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon him. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Jesus removed this barrier. Peter didn't see this coming. He didn't expect this at all. As a matter of fact, after this happened, he actually struggled with it for a while. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul talks about, he said, when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, and James was, this is probably the brother of Jesus, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So all the Jews were congregating all the time in Jerusalem, and all the Jewish leaders were there, the Jewish believers. So these men came from Jerusalem, these Jewish believers, and they met with Peter. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. This change, Peter wasn't expecting at all. And that's why this was a big deal. That's why he's sitting there thinking about it. You know? And so God was going beyond what Peter could see. And not only what was happening at the front door, but also the greater thing that God was doing between Jews and Gentiles. And that is what God does with his plans. He shows us things beyond what we are able to see. I like this scripture, Jeremiah 33:3. He says, call to me and I will answer you and show you great and mighty things which you do not know. That means God has got a lot of things going on that you and I never even thought of. Never had a thought of, never had a plan of. He's doing things that we don't expect, things that we can't even imagine, things that we can't see. And he'll bring them right before us. So, because he's doing that, because he's got these plans, because he's involving all these people, you know, because he prepares us and he's changing things and his plans go beyond what we can imagine, the last two things we need to do is don't doubt God's plans. Because he's in charge. He's in control. Verse 20, he says, arise therefore, go down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. When God lays a plan out before us, don't doubt it. Even if it seems off the wall, even if it seems impossible. You know, because Peter was probably thinking, why would I even go down and speak to these guys at the front door? I don't know them. They're Gentiles. Why would I go deal with them? Let alone go with them to Caesarea. Why would I do that? But God told him, don't doubt it, Peter. Just go. Just go. Trust me. You know, a lot of times we'll find certain parts of God's plans believable, but other parts of them not. Look at Moses. Moses may have believed that God would release the Israelites out of Egypt, but without a military conflict, without the Israelites rising up and fighting against the Egyptians, or maybe calling in an outside army to help them, oh, they can't do that. If they're going to be free, they're going to have to fight. You know? And then with Goliath, God may provide a champion to fight Goliath, but that little scrawny kid who goes and watches the sheep, he's going to defeat him? No, that's not going to happen. When God reveals his plan, we should have done. And a good example of that is Mary, Jesus' mother. The angel told her, you're going to have a son, even though you did not know a man. And Mary's response was, let it be according to your word. She said, okay. It'll happen. So, don't doubt God's plans. And the last thing we need to do is just simply obey them. And that's what Peter did. He went down, he talked to them. They told him about how they were sent by Cornelius. And in verse 23, he invited them in and lodged them. The next day, Peter went away with them, and some brethren from Joppa accompanied him. Peter did what God said to do. And this must have been really difficult for him. You go a couple chapters ahead, and Peter has to explain to the believers in Jerusalem, after Cornelius and his family accept Christ, he has to go back to Jerusalem and explains to the other Jewish believers what had happened, that God offered salvation to the Gentiles directly. And the first thing they do is they complain to Peter that he ate with Gentiles. They couldn't accept that, let alone salvation. Why would God do that? You went and ate with these guys. You hung out with them. So this had to be difficult for Peter to go and do this. He never dreamed of doing this on his own. But when God told him this was his plan, Peter said okay, and he jumped in fully. And what we see is not only did Peter talk with these guys at the front door, he said, come on in and stay with me. He brought these unclean Gentiles into the house, and he lodged them, and he fed them, and they stayed with him. And then not only did he go with them the next day to another Gentile's house, he said to some other believing Jews, he said, hey brothers, you go with me, let's go see what God's doing. And he took them, he involved them in this as well. When Peter realized this was God's plan, he obeyed. And that's what God wants. When he shows us what he's doing, he wants us to obey. And so that's what we see here, is God's got a plan, he's going to get it done. We need to obey God's plan. Okay? And all these others are how God gets from here to here. A lot of stuff going on. But that's kind of what we got to realize. We think God's doing a few things. God's doing a bunch of things we can't see. A bunch of things we can't understand. He's talking to a bunch of people we don't even know about. You know, all kinds of stuff that's taking place. You know, God has a reason for everything he does. Ezekiel 14:23, he says, you shall know that I have done nothing without cause that I have done in it, says the Lord. Everything God does, he has a reason. If God has a reason, he has a purpose, and he has a plan. So, what we see today through this story of Cornelius, I know we waded through a lot of stuff. God works his plan out to bring about his purpose. He's got a purpose, he's got a goal, and he's going to work it all out. He's doing a lot of things. And I think maybe that's what we need to understand through all this, is that we're doing a little, God's doing a lot. We think we've got great understanding of what's going on. We don't know a fraction of what's going on. But God does. So we trust in him. He's going to fulfill his plan. He's going to do it. He's going to use faithful people to get it done. And he will send us to others to involve them. And then we are also to involve other people so that he prepares us for the plan he's doing, because his plans bring change. And then his plans reach beyond what we can see. So we need to just not doubt his plan and obey him. He had a plan to get the gospel to the Gentiles. A lot of things took place in order for that to happen. Things that only God could do. So we did a lot of stuff. I know it took through a lot. They want to come up and close us out.